Boker Tov, good morning. We are in the final chapter of Shemuel Aleph, chapter 31. If you're following in the Rabbi Sachs Hebrew English, it's page 715 in the middle of the page. We're reminded that although we're going to call this the last chapter of Shemuel Aleph, we noted in our introduction many weeks ago, many months ago, that the breakdown of the book of Shemuel into two books is really more of an artificial breakdown. That was more how the Christians divided up the chapters, and then because the book of Shemuel was 50 plus chapters, they sort of divided it into two books, one of which culminates, as we're going to read this chapter, with the kingdom of Shaul, and then the next book is going to begin the kingdom of David. But technically, it really was always supposed to be one book. So we're calling this the end of a book for, I guess our own sake, to kind of feel accomplished. 31 chapters is a lot, and it is going to conclude the kingdom of Shaul. So there will be a sense of a completion, of an ending over here. But as soon as we finish this chapter, we're going to go into the first chapter of Shemuel Bet, because there is a progression one into the other. So chapter 31 comes back to the story of Shaul. We know that in chapter 28, Shaul received the futuristic prediction from the Eshet Ov that he was going to conduct this battle against the Pelishtim, and he was going to die. And his children were going to die in that battle. Nevertheless, Shaul forges on and fights the battle. And unfortunately, in this chapter, we're going to read about his tragic end and the end of his children. There will be a hint of optimism towards the end of the chapter, but overwhelmingly, this very short chapter is going to end with a bit of a pit in our stomach as we begin the next book, Shemuel Bet. So again, 7:15, chapter 31 of Shemuel Aleph, where it says, Uplishtim nilchamim b'Yisrael. Uplishtim nilchamim b'Yisrael, the Pelishtim waged war against the Jewish people. Vayanusu anshe Yisrael mipnei Pelishtim. The Jewish people retreated from before the Pelishtim. Vayipelu chalalim behar haGilboa. And many soldiers died on the mountains of Gilboa. Vayadbeku Pelishtim et Shaul ve'et banav. The Pelishtim closed in on Shaul and his children. Vayaku Pelishtim et Yehonatan ve'et Avinadav ve'et Malkishua b'nei Shaul. The Pelishtim managed to kill Yonatan, who we know him very well, David's best friend, et Avinadav and Malkishua, all three of whom were b'nei Shaul. So the Pelishtim killed the three sons of Shaul. Verse 3, Vatichbad ha-milchama el Shaul, the battle rages on in a heavy way towards Shaul. Vayimtseuhu hamorim anashim bakashet. And some archers they locate Shaul, and they shoot arrows at him. Vayahel me'od hamorim. And the archers, severely wound Shaul. Verse 4, Vayomed Shaul enoseh kelav. Shaul turns to his arms bearer. We've seen this concept many times, that leaders of war walked together with their arms bearer. We saw this many chapters ago when Yonatan took his arms bearer to fight against the camp of the Pelishtim one-on-one. So typically, leaders and warriors carried their weapons with an arms bearer. So he tells his arms bearer, Shlof harbecha, draw your sword, v'dokreni ba, and stab me with it. Pen yavo ha'arelim ha'elle, lest these uncircumcised heathens come, udkaruni v'het'alelubi, and they will stab me, and they will mock me and jeer me. V'lo ava noseh kelav ki yareh me'od, but the arms bearer refused to heed Shaul's wishes of taking out his sword and delivering the final blow to Shaul, ki yareh me'od, because he was very fearful. This was a traumatic event for the arms bearer to take a sword to the king of Israel. Vayikach Shaul et hacherev vayipol aleha. So Shaul takes the sword and he falls on his sword to kill himself. So much has been discussed about. We know that the halakha does not necessarily allow for suicide and killing oneself, but in this situation, most of the commentaries explain that since Shaul was wounded and he knew that this wound was going to kill him, he knew there was no chance of survival, he made the calculation, and rightfully so, that it would be better for him as the king of Israel to die in his own way than to be captured and mocked by the Pilishtim, potentially tortured for information if that was something that they would do. But better to fall and die in dignity on one's own than to die in the hands of the enemy, and knowing that he was going to die didn't matter. So Shaul exercised his divine right as a king to make that decision for himself. And we've seen that in other times in history, many great people have made those decisions, not easy ones, for themselves to take their own life, lest they go into the hands of the enemy or die al Chilul Hashem. So this would be a situation of a Kiddush Hashem versus a Chilul Hashem, which we know that taking one's life for the purposes of a Kiddush Hashem is acceptable according to halakha. So Shaul ruled that for himself as the king of Israel. He falls on his sword to kill himself. What we will find, however, is that there is a little bit of a missing detail that will come about in the first chapter of Shemuel Bet, that in fact there was another person who struck Shaul. Even after Shaul fell on his sword, apparently somebody else comes and strikes Shaul at his command. We will see that in the first chapter of the next book of Shemuel Bet. So keep that on hold, at least the way the narrative presents it here. Shaul, because his arms bearer refuses to strike him down, strikes himself down. The reaction of the arms bearer is, again, very, very emotionally distraught. Pasuk Hey, Vayar noseh kelav kimet Shaul. The arms bearer sees that Shaul has died. Vayipol gamhu al harbo vayamot imo. And so he too falls on his sword and dies together with the king. He takes his own life at the tragic sight of the death of the king, knowing that he probably too will be taken into harm's way. And so he takes his life as well. Pasuk Vav. Vayamot Shaul ushloshet banav v'noseh kelav. On this day, Shaul, his 3 sons, and his arms bearer are killed. They die. Gam kol anashav bayom hahu yachdav, as well as all his men died together on that day. So Shaul and his army suffer a terrible loss. All of the men, the entire legion, the entire battalion perish on this day from before the Pilishtim. Pasuk Zayin, vayir'u anshe Yisrael asher be'ever ha'emek va'asher be'ever ha'yarden ki nasu anshe Yisrael. The men of Israel, the other citizens of Israel, who are in on the other side of the valley and can see what's taking place in the battle. They can gather what's going on. And those who are on Ever HaYarden, on the other side of the Transjordan, the tribes of Reuven, Gad, and Menashe, they see Ki Nasu Anshe Yisrael, that the Jewish people have fled and retreated. V'chimetu Shaul ubanav, and that Shaul and his children have died. V'ya'azvu et ha'arim v'yanusu, they quickly pick up and abandon their towns, knowing that the Pilishtim are going to come to attack them as well. Vayavo'u Pilishtim vayeshvu bahem, and the Pilishtim come and occupy those towns that the Jewish people have fled and abandoned. So this is a horrible loss for the Jewish people. The book of Shemuel Aleph, the kingdom of Shaul, essentially ends exactly as under the same conditions that Shaul was brought into power. So if you go all the way back to the early chapters of the book of Shemuel, we already saw the Jewish people fall to the Pilishtim. That's when the Aron was confiscated. Eli and his children, Eli's children died in battle. Eli then died after hearing the news of his children dying in battle. So there's sort of a bookend, an envelope structure to this book of Shemuel Aleph, starting from the beginning to the end, where the Jewish people die at the hands of the Pilishtim. They fall to the hands of the Philistines. The leader and his children, whether it's Eli and his children or Shaul and his children, die. And we're once again left kingless, sort of at the mercy of the Pilishtim. The Pilishtim are reigning over us. And one of Shaul's major missions, one of the reasons why he was crowned to be king, was to free us from the tyrannical rule of the Pilishtim. And unfortunately, his kingdom ends. He dies having not accomplished that goal. There were some ups and downs, but in the end of the day, we are now in the same position we were when Shaul was originally crowned as king. And so that's going to segue us into David's rise and his attempt to try and accomplish what Shaul failed to accomplish, which is freeing us from the Pilishtim. Questions on the first 7 or so verses? Yes. Well, I think there is positive here in Shaul in that despite knowing what's going to happen to him, Shaul knew coming into this battle, he was going to die. He knew the decree upon him by God. He had had it reiterated several times by Shemuel. He just had that premonition from the Eshet of, who brought Shemuel back to life to tell him that Shaul knows he's going to die and he knows his children are going to die. And so you could have imagined none of us would have blamed Shaul if he picked up and ran away and just fled and just abandoned his people and said, hey, I'm not going to do this. But Shaul doesn't do that. Knowing what's going to take place, he nevertheless fortifies himself and his people and says, we have no choice. We have to make an attempt. He goes in, he fights valiantly, but he and his people suffer a very tragic loss. At the very least, the fact that Shaul experienced a level of givurah, a level of strength, knowing that he would lose, but still doing the right thing in leading his people into battle is a positive, at least to say, as he goes out, right? You know, in that kind of way. Yeah. Certainly, Shaul's missteps are the cause of why his monarchy is unsuccessful, at least by the measures that he was originally crowned as king. He was crowned as king to save the Jewish people from the Philistines and to destroy Amalek, both of which he failed to do, both of which we will see David, his successor, will be successful at doing, because David is able to keep himself straight to the path of God, where Shaul, unfortunately, despite all his great character, was unsuccessful. He misstepped, right? And that's the tragedy of Shaul's monarchy versus the success of David's monarchy. We've always been not afraid to criticize Shaul. Shemuel criticized him. We brought out in the text, but we've also looked for the positives within Shaul. Somebody who, you know, our heart breaks for him as we read this chapter. She was such a great person, somebody who had so much potential, someone who did many great things, but someone who ultimately will be remembered for having all of this potential and not fulfilling it and not meeting it. His couple of mistakes that he made are too devastating for him to overcome for his monarchy to be successful. And despite valiantly trying to lead the people, having a tremendous amount of courage and bravery and strength, several times admitting his mistake when he finally realized he shouldn't have been chasing David, nevertheless, it just falls a little bit short, a little bit too little too late, as they like to say. But Shaul is remembered as this very conflicted figure. His legacy is somebody who is great and had the potential to be great, but sort of maybe needed to fail in order to pave the way for David to come up the ranks and success him, right? I guess that's what we would have to say, you know? Let us keep reading here. The chapter will get even a little bit more tragic and gory, unfortunately, but we'll end on something of a positive note. Vahimi mahorat, the following day, vayavo Pelishtim lefashet et halalim. The Pelishtim come to brutally strip those who were killed, to take their possessions, to take their armor, to pillage the people who have been killed. Vayimtzeu et Shaul ve'esheloshet banav noflim behara Gilboa. And they find the corpses of Shaul and his 3 sons having been slain and fallen in the mountains of Gilboa. Verse 9, Vayichretu et rosho, they behead them. Vayavshitu et kelav, and they strip their armor and their weapons from them. Vayshalehu be'eretz Pelishtim saviv, they send word amongst all of the lands of the Pelishtims all over, levaser bet atzabehem ve'et ha'am, to spread the news to the house of Atzabehem. Atzabehem comes from the word like etzeb, pain or suffering. Basically, it's a derogatory, euphemistic term by the text of our Tanakh to describe the idols and temples of the Pelishtim. So when the Torah speaks of the temples of idolatry, it calls them by a derogatory name called Bet Atzabehem, the house of their suffering. It's a way of demeaning the idolatry. It means in this context that the Pelishtim sent word for their people to worship their gods and to give praise to their gods for the victory over Shaul and the Jewish people. So they spread the word. In other words, the Pelishtim now are going to make a public display of their victory over Shaul, his sons, and the Jewish people. Verse 10, Vayasimu et kelav bet ashtarot. They placed his armor in the temple of Ashtarot, the idolatry, Ashtarot. Ve'et giviyato tak'u behomat Bet Shan. And they impaled his body on the wall of Bet Shan on display for all to see. Verse 11, Vayishme'u elav yoshve Yavesh Gilad. There was a group of inhabitants in the land called Yavesh Gilad. That's a Jewish town. We might remember the town of Yavesh Gilad from the book of Shoftim, if you recall. The town of Yavesh Gilad were one of the towns that did not come out to fight against the tribe of Binyamin in the story of Pilegesh Begiv'ah, for those who were with us during the book of Shoftim. And as a result, they suffered a great loss. The rabbis of that time period told the Jewish people to obliterate Yavesh Gilad. They only left the women alive. They had the women pair with Binyamin and so on. So Yavesh Gilad has been something of a negative town, but then also we find that they assisted David a little bit. So they're also positive. They're an interesting group of people. The Yavesh Gilad inhabitants are very very zealous, and they are not going to allow Shaul and his children to be put on display in such an embarrassing and debasing way for the Jewish people. So they hear what's going on. The news spreads about what the Pelishtim are doing. They hear et asher asu Pelishtim to Shaul, what the Pelishtim did for Shaul. Now, to plan a mission to save Shaul and his 3 children and their bodies is a dangerous mission. Many people would probably say, not worth putting our life at risk for such a thing. But the embarrassment and shame that the Jewish people are suffering, having their king and his 3 sons being put on display, their bodies being put on display, is not something that the people of Yavesh Gilad are prepared to tolerate. So in verse 12, in Pasuk Yurbet, on the top of page 717 in our Rabbi Sachs Tanakh, it says, Vayakumu kol ish hayim, all of the men of valor, Vayelchu kol alayla, they went and traveled throughout the night. Vayikchu et Giviyat Shaul, they plan a stealth mission in the middle of the night to steal back Shaul, his body, and the body of his 3 children, Ve'et Giviyot banav, mechomat Bet Shan, from the public display and impaled Bet Shan. Vayavo Yavesha vayisrefu otam sham, and they bring the body back and they burn the bodies of Shaul and his 3 children. Now, you might say that seems to be something that we don't typically do. However, this was common practice to do to kings, that specifically for kings and royalties is very common in that time period to burn their bodies, right? Yes, this was common. This seemed to be a practice that was adopted over here by the Jewish people that was in keeping with what they did in the time of in those times, even with the bodies of Goyim, right? So I think that Radak over here makes a comment. He says, "Vayisrefu otam sham tirgem Yonatan vekalu alehon kemad dekalhan al chayat taman." Right? He says that they burnt their bodies in the way that the bodies of typical kings were burnt. It says, "If shar shayad da'ato kemo shekatvu rabotenu sorfim al hamelachim umahen sorfim alehem mitatam ukle tashmishan oda'ato." So one option that Adak does to try and reconcile the fact that we don't typically burn bodies is he says it doesn't mean over here that they burnt the actual bodies of the king. They buried their bodies. What it means is that they burnt the possessions of the king. So what typically happened is that after a king passed away, they would take all of the possessions of the king and they would burn it. What would be the reasoning behind that? What's the logic behind doing that? Not, so that people don't steal it, even the members. It's, in other words, a sign of respect that nothing that belonged to the king should be used by anybody else. For someone else to use something that belonged to the king would be to demean the honor of the king. So Radak, based on Targum Yonatan, says it doesn't mean that they burnt the bodies. It means that they burnt all of the possessions of the king, so no one else would be able to use it as a sign of honor and respect for the king. But apparently they buried the bodies. That's one option that Radak goes by. What does it say over there?
Here it says, cremation was not a Hebrew practice, but it is possible that in this case, the bodies were so badly decomposed that it was considered an affront to the dead to bury them in that state.
Okay, so that's another option, taking it more literally that they were burnt, and only in this situation was it allowed, given the fact that they had suffered such wounds and decapitation and things like that, that burial at that point would not have been the most dignified, respectable way of burying. Another option that Radak over here presents is He says, "O da'ato al serefat besamim kemo vayahantu harofim," that it's another possibility is that they burnt incense with the bodies. That very similar to what they used to do in Egypt. They used to embalm the pharaohs to preserve their bodies so that their bodies wouldn't smell or rot any further. He says, "V'yitachen nefaresh ki habasar sarfu she'ela rima v'lo ratzu lekovram ima tolaim." That's who did they quote? Who they brought that from? That's the Dak. That's Rabbi David Kimhi. So over here it says that it's possible that they did burn the flesh because the bodies had rotted and decomposed. There were worms and stuff like that. That lo haya derech kavod. It would not have been the most respectable way to bury them. V'sarfu habasar v'kavru ha'atzamot. They burnt the flesh and then buried the bones. Okay, so any one of these possible explanations is something that you can take. Bottom line is, the key takeaway is that these members of Yavesh Gilad, members of the Jewish people, took it upon themselves to put their lives at risk to preserve the honor of the king. And despite whatever Shaul may have meant to the overwhelming population of the Jewish people, he was still the king. He still deserved great honor. He still did many great things. And it's very positive. It's very uplifting and comforting to see that members of the Jewish people would go to such lengths to preserve the honor and dignity of their king in whatever way we want to wish to explain it. The final pasuk of the book, Vayikhu et atzmotehem vayikberu tahat ha'eshel b'yavesha. They took the bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Yavesh. Vayatsumu shiv'at yamim, and they fasted for 7 days in grieving for the loss of the king and his 3 sons, and as well all of the other Jewish people who died in battle. So the book of Shemuel Aleph ends on a very bittersweet, more bitter than sweet note. There is an element of positivity, of hope, in that the Jewish people bury his body, they retrieve the body, there's enough fortitude there, but overwhelmingly the chapter ends with a lot of sadness, grief for the loss of Shaul's monarchy, his 3 sons who have died, and the fact that we are now left kingless and on our heels as a Jewish people. We've retreated, we fled many of our cities, and now we have to pick up the pieces and try again under a new king that's going to be David to rid ourselves of the Pelishti tyranny that we've been going through for so many years.
We're kingless only because the people don't know.
Well, the people do have a sense that David is going to take over, but they've lost the official king, and now David is going to obviously step into that role in a more formal and recognizable way. But he's going to have his challenges and his hills and battles to overcome as well. Yeah. I'm trying to see, I think there was one point that I wanted to bring over here. No, I think we pretty much covered it. I'll read to you his last words here. Anshe Yavesh Gilad zachru l'Shaul et hasdo. The members of Yavesh Gilad repaid Shaul for a kindness that Shaul did to them. Biyoto hayachid she'etzliach legayes et kol ha'am l'sayah lahem b'mtzukatam hakashe ba'alot alehem nachash ha'amoni. This is what I wanted to remind ourselves of. Right? He doesn't like Naveen. The same love Naveen. Yeah, he finished. It's sad. It's also a sad chapter. You know, he's feeling the pain. That's good. So go back to chapter 11. The people of Yavesh Gilad had an interaction with Shaul. The Nachash Ha'amoni, the Ammonites, were coming to attack the Jewish people, and they were descending upon this place, Yavesh Gilad. And if you recall, at that time, Shaul hadn't fully accepted his position as king. There were some people who still questioned him, some people who weren't fully buying into the fact that Shaul was really the king. And so the people of Yavesh Gilad were under heavy attack. You remember the language that the Nachash used? He said, I'm going to poke out your eyeballs. He told that to the people. He used very graphic, difficult language about that. Yeah, you remember, Esther? Do you remember that story? Yeah, it's chapter 11. And what did Shaul do? Shaul, he hacked up an animal into 12 pieces, and he sent it to all of the people around the Jewish people. What did he tell them? He said, anybody who doesn't come to fight and defend your brothers in Yavesh Gilad, you're going to end up like this cow. I'm going to hack you up. Shaul was very tough, right? He went at the rest of the Jewish people. That's okay. Don't worry about it. He was so good. It was good. It's not easy to sit through a class. I can tell that to the adults. Don't worry. So what happened over here? The people of Yavesh Gilad were under attack by the Ammonites, by Nahash Ammoni, and it seemed like there was a lot of indifference amongst the Jewish people. For those who remember going back to the book of Shoftim, whenever an enemy would come up, the Jewish people as a whole kind of said like, deal with it on your own, right? The Jewish people were very divided, different tribes. Anytime a tribe came under attack, the rest of the tribes would not be so enthusiastic about coming to the defense of this one tribe. They kind of like left them and said like, handle your business. We got other things to worry about. The Jewish people were very tribal. That was the problem in the book of Shoftim. One of the things that Shaul was brought in to do was to unite the people, right? To stop that tribalism and to say, when one of your brothers is under attack, you have to rally to support them. So when Shaul first took office as the king, and people were not so sure that he was really the guy for the job, they were going against him. In this chapter, chapter 11, Nachash Ammoni came to battle Yavesh Gilad, and the people of Yavesh Gilad told Shaul about it, and Shaul said, absolutely not, you will not do this battle alone. And Shaul threatened the rest of the Jewish people that they had to come to the aid of the people of Yavesh Gilad, and if they didn't, Shaul would take retribution on them. It was one of Shaul's really crowning moments. It was a really top-notch moment for Shaul. And the Jewish people respond, and they save the people of Yavesh Gilad from Nachash Ha'amoni, right? That was one of Shaul's highlights. That was one of the top moments of his kingdom where he was able to get the Jewish people out of their tribalism, one of his major goals of his monarchy. By the end, the people of Yavesh Gilad repay Shaul for the debt that they owed him, having saved them. And they are the ones who go to retrieve the body of Shaul. So I think it's somewhat comforting that the book ends with a sense of Jewish people caring about their brothers, very different than the way the book of Shoftim ended. The book of Shoftim, if you remember, ended with infighting, civil war, a lot of tension between the Jewish people. And so while not everything about Shaul's monarchy has improved before he was put in as king, the Jewish people are still under the Philistine rule. At least one thing maybe we can say Shaul did accomplish by the end, the feeling that Jewish people owe a debt to other members of the Jewish people, that when one group of Jewish people do something good for the other, there's a sense of feeling that I have to repay that we're looking out for each other. So while the Jewish people are still suffering at the hands of the Philistine, and we're going to need David HaMelech to kind of help that out, one thing that we can say Shaul accomplished by the end is that he at least brought the Jewish people together. There is not that same feeling of tribalism that existed prior to Shaul's monarchy. The monarchy at least united the Jewish people to think of themselves as all one people. And that when someone is in need, we come to help, right? And someone does something good, we pay back that debt. And I think that that's a very positive thing to at least take away from what is a very tragic end to our Sefer. Questions, thoughts, comments on that? Okay, very good. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to move right along. As I mentioned in the opening, that the book of Shemuel is really one book. So I'd rather not end on chapter 31, especially on such a tragic ending, but rather to go into Shemuel Aleph. So we're now, Shemuel Bet. Shemuel Bet, Perek Aleph is what we're going to do for the remaining 20 or so minutes of today's shiur. So we're on page 717. What we're now going to hear is about David's reaction to the news that Shaul and his children have died. Remember, David was not part of this battle. If you remember, David was at one point on the enemy side. He was actually on the Philistine side, and God orchestrated it so that David would not come to battle, that he would be left back. David had his whole debacle in chapters 29 and 30 with the people of Amalek. But while all that's going on with David's fighting a separate war, that's when Shaul is losing to the Philistines. So David has no knowledge of what took place with Shaul and his three sons and the heavy loss that the Jewish people have. He's going to find out about it now in chapter 1 of Shemuel Bet, and we're going to see David's reaction to this terrible loss. Vahi acharei mot Shaul. It was after the death of Shaul. V'David shav mehakot et ha'amalek. David returned from having been victorious against the nation of Amalek. Vayeshev David betziklag yamim shenaim. David resided together with his men in the place of Tziklag for 2 days after the victory. Vahi bayom hashelishi. It was on the third day. The third day is always an ominous day. Vehine ish ba min hamachane me'im Shaul. There was a fugitive who ran away from the camp of Shaul. Ubgadav kiru'im, and his garments were torn. Va'adama al rosho, and there was dust on his head. Garments torn, dust on your head. Signs of what? Mourning and grieving, right? Classic signs of mourning and grieving that this fugitive was exemplifying, which already clues David in before he even says anything, that something tragic has taken place. Vahi bevo'o el David, when this fugitive reaches David, vayipol aratza vayishtahu, he falls to the ground and he bows and prostrates before David. Verse 2, vayomed lo David, David says to him, emi ze tavo, where are you coming from? Vayomed elav, he says to him, mimachane Yisrael nimlatti, I ran away, escaped from the camp of the Jewish people. Verse 3, Vayomer elav David. David says, Mehaya davar. Tell me what happened. Hagednali. Please tell me what occurred. Vayomer, the fugitive says, Asher nas ha'am min hamalchama. The nation retreated and fled from the battlefield. V'gam harbe nafal min ha'am vayamutu. Many soldiers died from amongst the people. V'gam Shaul v'Yonatan beno metu. And Shaul and Yehonatan also died. Notice the way that the reporter tells the information to David. He works his way up to what is the buildup was probably going to be the most tragic news for David, is the death of the king and his son, who's David's best friend, Yonatan. Vayomer David, in verse 5, David says, El Hana'ar Hamagidlo, to the young lad who had given him this news, Ech yadata, tell me how you know, Ki met Shaul v'Yehonatan beno, that Shaul and Yonatan have died. Vayomer Hana'ar Hamagidlo, the young lad who tells him, who's the reporter, tells him, Nikro nikreti behar hal Gilboa, I happened to be on the mountains of Gilboa. V'hine Shaul nish'an al hanito, and I found Shaul laying on his sword. This is the details that we did not hear about in the last chapter. This was missing. As far as we know, Shaul asked his arms bearer to kill him. The arms bearer refused. Shaul fell on his sword and died from his own wounds. Now a new piece of the puzzle emerges from this lad who tells us that he actually found Shaul laying on his sword. And the chariots and horsemen of the Pelishtim were closing in on him, and Shaul realized he was going to be captured. Verse 7, Vayifen aharav vayireni, Shaul turned and looked around and saw me. This is the reporter telling the story. And he called to me, Vayikra elai, va'omar hineni, and I said, here I am. That's always a very interesting exchange when someone calls and the other person says hineni. Hineni is, I'm here to do what is necessary, right? We've had this type of motif in many stories throughout the Tanakh where someone is called to a job and someone says hineni is like a sign of, I'm ready to do what needs to be done, no matter how hard it might be. One time that comes to mind is when God says to Abraham before Akedat Yitzchak, before binding his son and going to kill his son, he says, Abraham, Vayomer Hineni. Abraham says, here I am, I'm ready to do what's necessary. When God calls to Moshe at the burning bush to give him his mission to take the Jewish people out of Egypt, a tough mission, he says Hineni. This motif of Hineni is being called upon to do the dirty work, to do a very difficult mission, a difficult task. He's going to be called on the task to kill Shaul. Verse 8, Vayomer li mi atta. He said to me, who are you? Va'omar elav, I responded to him, Amaleki anochi. I am actually a member of Amalek. We shall soon see that he was a convert from Amalek. Verse 9, Vayomer elai. Shaul said to me, Amod no alai umoteteni. Stand over me and kill me. Take my life. Ki ahazani hashavatz, because my agony has overtaken me. Ki kol od nafshi bi, and my soul is barely within me. I'm barely alive. In other words, Shaul was telling him, you can do this, right? You can take my life. I'm ready to die. I just cannot bear to be have that last shot being done by the Pelishtim or to be taken alive by the Pelishtim. Verse 10, Va'emod alav va'amotetehu. The reporter tells him, I indeed stood over him and I killed him. I finished him off. Ki yadati, for I knew ki lo yehye achare niflo. I knew that he would not survive after he had fallen on his sword. Va'ekah hanezer asher arosho. I took the crown off of his head. Ve'etzada asher al zero'o. And the armband, the arm bracelet that was on his forearm. Va'aviem el adoni hinna. And I brought them as signs of the king's death to my master. So clearly he's telling the truth, and he has proof of the fact that he was there at the time that Shaul died and that he in fact did it. Pasuk Yud Aleph, Vayachazek David bibgadav vayikraem. David took hold of his clothing and he tore his garments. Vegam kol ha'anashim asher ito. Together with all of the other people who were with him, hearing the news of the death of the king. Verse 12, Vayispedu vayifku. They eulogized and they cried, Vayatsumu ad ha'arev, and they fasted till the evening. Al Shaul ve'al Yehonatan beno, on Shaul and on Yonatan his son, ve'al am Adonai ve'al bet Israel, and on the people, the nation of God, and upon the house of Israel, kinafelu be'harev, because they fell by the sword. You could see the compassion, the sensitivity, the grief that David and his men feel for the loss of Jewish life. And don't forget, Shaul was his mortal enemy. Shaul had made life very difficult for David, chased him around the land of Israel, drove him out of the land of Israel, to the extent that David had to take refuge for several months, for almost over a year, amongst the Pelishtim. He had to live in enemy territory. David suffered a lot at the hands of Shaul, lost a lot at the hands of Shaul, yet immediately he understands the gravity of the loss of the king of Israel, what it means, not just on a personal level, but on a national level, to lose the king and for his sons and for so many Jewish soldiers to lose their life is something that David immediately triggers David into a sense of depression, of sadness, of grief over such a terrible and tragic loss. We may have expected David to feel a tinge of relief, maybe. I don't want to say happiness, but maybe relief over the fact that Shaul, who had been chasing him for so long, finally passed away. Maybe there's a little bit of excitement in the sense that now David realizes his time has come for him to step into the limelight and become the king. You don't feel any of those emotions from David at first glance. It is nothing but sadness and grief over that loss. And so you see the character of someone like David, who understands the implications beyond his own personal issues to what it's going to mean for the entire Jewish people. This is the type of person who has those qualities to be able to lead.
So I think also he's probably mourning for the loss of his dear friend.
That's true as well. Definitely the fact that the text consistently reiterates the loss of Yonatan, who is his dear friend, who he's made multiple covenants with him. And we'll see in his lamentation, in his eulogy that's about to come up, that David provides, he has a special spot in his heart and a special section of that lamentation that's going to be just reserved for Yonatan.
I think also it just shows that he's a true man of God, David, because he doesn't focus on himself, and he does focus on this man was appointed originally from Hashem as king, so it's the whole picture rather than his own personal.
Absolutely. Now, there is also the element that David wants to establish the office of the king because he knows he's also going to be in that position. So in other words, however David reacts to the loss of Shaul is how people will react to him. So David has a very important role to play here. And I don't want to say that this is all self-motivated. Obviously, like I said, I think David understands the impact. But there's another element, which is that David is modeling for the people how they're supposed to treat the king, whether they like what the king is doing or they don't, whether the king is always successful or the king sometimes fails. He is nevertheless, we've seen David refer to Shaul this way many times, and he will again, he is the Mashiach Hashem. He is the anointed one by God. You don't get to the position of being the anointed one by God without having certain qualities to you, without being chosen and selected by God and his Nevi'im, which means that you're not your average run-of-the-mill person. the fact that we sometimes criticize the king or look very deeply at some of his actions and analyze them to the negative is just because we expect so much from him and because there's a burden of responsibility upon him. But David says, never forget the fact that despite whatever you might think, he is ultimately the Mashiach Hashem. He is the anointed one by God. We saw this when David had his opportunities himself to kill Shaul. David, in two different chapters, chapter 24 and chapter 26, in the cave and in the camp, had two opportunities that were gifted to him on a silver platter to kill Shaul and rid himself of the enemy. And David, not for, well, we said in chapter 24, maybe for a moment hesitated, and he even was upset at himself for hesitating that way. And certainly in chapter 26, he made up for it. David would refuse to lay a finger on Shaul, and he made sure to tell everybody else not to touch Shaul because this is the Mashiach Hashem. No matter what we think of him, no matter what he's trying to do to us, we don't have the ability to lay a hand on Shaul. And now you're going to see what David's about to do to this young lad who did take the initiative to kill Shaul. You might think he's a hero, right? He did what Shaul asked him to do. He fled the battlefield to tell David. David is going to treat him harshly. Yeah.
Except that before that, it says that Shaul fell upon his sword.
Shaul did it for himself, yes.
So which rendition are we to accept?
I think you have to put the two stories together. And the first story in chapter 31 didn't give us this piece of information. It was more about what Shaul did to himself, and the fact that the arms bearer refused to do the act for him. But now we have a new detail that's embedded into here, which I think you have to combine into the story, which is that, yes, ultimately Shaul falling on his sword was going to kill him no matter what, but someone else finished him off.
The arms bearer is this person?
No, there's two different people. Remember, yes, the arms bearer in the previous chapter refused to touch Shaul. And then when he saw Shaul, remember, Shaul asked him to kill him before he fell on his sword. That nothing happened to Shaul. The arms bearer said, absolutely not. I will not kill the king, right? So Shaul fell on his sword. At the sight of Shaul falling on his sword, the arms bearer killed himself. Somewhere right after that, which the last chapter did not tell us, is when this story takes place where Shaul sees this Amalek guy and he finishes off the job.
How do you trust him?
Who?
How did Shaul trust this guy who said he's Amalek?
It
He
wasn't
wasn't going to turn him over to the.
in Shaul's mind, just ending with the Pelishtim was the most important part not to happen. Yeah, exactly. Now, if you were David, how would you treat this reporter?
Question. I have a question.
Yes, who's that?
It's Liz. Is there any
Yes.
commentary that supposes that perhaps this guy is making up this story? Or is it like accepted fully that this is just a detail that wasn't part of the first story?
I haven't seen anybody.
Because it seems logical
it's-
that the guy is just doing it to get in good with somebody who knows is going to be in power.
That is possible. That is possible. I just don't know. He's saying, and he didn't think that would potentially cause him to lose his standing, I guess, right? In other words, you think that maybe this Amalek guy is making up the part of the story, and he's doing it because he thinks he'll be considered a hero for what he did. Really, it turns out not to be that way. Interesting. I'd have to do some research and see. Nothing that I'm seeing is popping up in that way. I don't know if anybody, do you see anything in your commentaries that bring it that? I didn't see anything.
It says,
I'm going to take a look
the
here.
story might be reconciled with the account, and assuming that Shaul had not died immediately after falling upon his sword, but
Right.
had struggled to his feet again by supporting himself on his spear, and that his arms bearer had presumed too hastily that Shaul was dead, but they do not ignore the alternative explanation held by some modern scholars that the story of the Amaleki was a fabrication.
Uh-huh. So it seems as though some modern scholars want to say that he fabricated that story and that he made it up to try and get in the king's good graces, which turns out to backfire on him because David is about to kill him.
He said that
Huh?
Amalek guy is telling the
Yes, but I guess what you would basically say is that the Amaleki came, he found Shaul dead, took the crown and the armband, and then pretended to tell David that he was the one who finished him off. Why he would make that up, I guess the only explanation that I have is to put himself into the good graces of David. That would only seem to be the only logical explanation. Well, he could have easily said, the Amaleki could have easily said, I came by, I saw Shaul dead, I picked these things up and I brought them to you, right? He didn't have to, if in fact it's a false narrative, he didn't have to say that. He could have easily said, I found this and I brought it back to you. But it definitely seems as though he thinks that doing the king's bidding and filling was a good thing. David is going to tell him, no, it's not a good thing, right?
Because that's always been his standard line.
Yeah. The motivation for saying that the Amaleki made it up is the fact that this detail was not presented to us in the previous chapter. But I don't think you have to go to that length. I don't know. For me, we found many times stories that are then repeated, and sometimes there are details missing the first time the story is mentioned from when the story is repeated around the second time for whatever reason. It wasn't relevant in the previous chapter. It's now becoming relevant in this chapter as we're talking to this Amaleki. So what I'd like to do is proceed forward. I want to try and finish just the Pisukim, and then maybe in our next class, before we begin chapter 2, we'll take a little bit more of a deeper dive into some of the elements of chapter 1. But I would just like to finish off the Pisukim here in chapter 1. So let's take a look at verse 13, Pasuk Gimel, and then we'll have an opportunity to look a little deeper next class. Vayomer David el hana'ar hamagid lo. Oh wait, I read those already. Yeah, did I read those? No. Vayomer David el hana'ar hamagid lo. David said to the young man who had brought him this news, Emi ze'ata, where are you from? Now this doesn't mean where did you come from, because he already asked him that. He knows he came. He wants to know, where is your origin? Like, where did you grow up? Where did you start from? Vayomer, he says, Ben ish ger Amaleki anochi. I am the son of an Amaleki convert. Very interesting. Now, the Amalek undertones over here are very interesting over here, right? What do you say? Right. The fact that he's already claiming Amalek puts us at some suspicion of him, because Amalek is our arch nemesis. We have an obligation to macho imche et zecher Amalek, to completely destroy the nation of Amalek. But this man claims to be a son of a convert from Amalek. So this is interesting. Now, David is about to kill this person. The question is, why does he kill him, right? It says, Vayomer elav David. David says to him in verse 14, Ech lo yareta lishloach yadecha leshahet et Mashiach Adonai. How is it that you were not afraid to send forth your hand and strike down the anointed one of God? In other words, I've been afraid to do that. Everybody else has been afraid to do that. How is it that you weren't afraid to kill Shaul? Right, but still, nevertheless, for you to even deliver the final blow in David's mind, how could you be so callous? Let it happen. How could you do that? Correct. That's what David's coming from. And David doesn't even wait to hear an argument back from him. Verse 15, Tetvav, Vayikra David le'achad mehane'arim. David thereupon calls one of his attendants, Vayomer, and he says to him, Gash pegabo, come over and strike him. Vayakehu vayamot. And the Na'ar kills him right then and there on the spot. The reporter is dead. The Amaleki, the son of Dager Amaleki, is killed. Now, Vayomer elav, David says to him in verse 16, after he struck him down, Damecha al roshecha, your blood is on your head, meaning it was your fault that you died. Kificha ana becha lemor, because your own lips testified about yourself, saying, Anochi motati et Mashiach Adonai, I put to death the anointed one of God. David makes a very, very powerful statement, and he does it publicly. Nobody is allowed to ever, under any circumstances, send forth their hand towards the king of Israel. Ironic, because David himself was pursued by Shaul and will continue to be pursued throughout his life of people wanting to kill him. His own sons will rebel against him. So David, who makes a public display of don't touch the king, now he's going to become the king, is going to be chased down by many people who seek to destroy him and kill him, right? Perhaps the irony is telling us that maybe David did not do the right thing over here. Maybe he was too harsh. I don't know. It's worth delving into. We have a couple of things here in this chapter that we need to clarify and look for further investigation.
But even if you say it was too harsh for those reasons, it was still the right thing because he's part of Amalek.
So that is an interesting question. The interesting question is, did David use this as an excuse to kill somebody who he felt was already deserving of death because he came from Amalek, or was it really because of this? And this actually perpetuates a larger discussion, which we don't have time for now. Maybe we'll pick up with it in our next class, amongst the commentators, which is, do we accept converts from Amalek? Because remember, he's the son of a convert from Amalek. So perhaps if somebody converts from Amalek to Judaism, their previous history of being a member of Amalek is no longer of consequence to us. We would not kill him, right? Amalek, for people who maintain their identity as members of Amalek. But if somebody wishes to convert from Amalek to the Jewish people, perhaps they're not deserving of death at that point. We would welcome them with open
But
arms.
then he's already second generation, we should know better than to kill the king.
Then it's because of the king. So the question really becomes,
Was he really, his father converted, but that doesn't mean he followed in his father's.
but once his father converts, and presumably his father married a Jewish woman and birthed him, he's a full-fledged Jew, right? He has a convert father, but he's a full-fledged Jew. Would he be deserving of death? Would he be deserving of death because he came from somebody who was from Amalek? That's the debate. If you say we don't accept converts from Amalek, and this man managed to slip his way in, but David says that was a mistake, that was an oversight, and he and all his progeny need to be killed, you could say David was motivated by the Amalek factor to kill him and use this as an excuse. I think most commentaries look at the fact that he killed him not because he was from Amalek, but rather because he stretched his hand against the anointed one of God. He killed Shaul as proof positive that had he not done that, David would have preserved him. David would have said, you're a full-fledged Jew, you're legitimate, as proof that he would accept him. Yes. He says, I'm a ger, I'm a convert from Amalek. You're saying, why did he add that Amalek thing into it? It's interesting. You're saying that from the fact that the text highlights that he was a convert of Amalek, and instead of just saying, I am a convert, adds another dimension to this conversation, which maybe that was going through David's mind. I hear that side of the coin as well. Right. It could be that David maybe saw in this action of the convert of Amalek killing the king an element of his Amalekness coming out, in that he cruelly killed the king when he shouldn't have. Even though you could argue, right, that maybe the act of killing the king was in his mind was a merciful act. Here's the king suffering on his sword, succumbing to death from his wounds. End it, right? Put him out of his misery. The king is asking me to put him out of his misery. You could see the tension that this young man had, right? You could appreciate the tension he had. On the one hand, here's the king telling him, kill me. And you see him suffering. He's saying, put me out of my misery. I don't want to be fell into the hands of the enemy. He has a lot of logic, a lot of reason to follow through with the king's request. But then David ends up killing him because he did it, right? He's stuck between a rock and a hard place, as they like to say. Yeah. Yeah. In this case, it means he's a convert. He's a traveler from different places, but ger, sojourner, is a fancy word in this context for saying he's a convert. Yeah. That's the fancy English word for ger. Ger meaning a stranger. I'm a stranger, I'm a sojourner, I move from place to place. In this context, he's saying I'm a convert. That's really what he means. Yeah.
When Shaul asked him, who are you?
We don't have a conversation recorded by Shaul to him. Oh, we do have one in this chapter, yeah. When Shaul asked him, Mi'ata, he told him, Amaleki anochi, I'm Amalek. Now when he says it to David, he says, I'm the son of a ger of Amalek. So there's a lot of weird things happening over here, right? Maybe this does give a little bit more credence to the opinions who want to say it was a fabricated story, because this guy can't get his story straight, right? He keeps changing and waffling and adding details. So there's some fascinating things that are going on over here, and some questions that we have that are left somewhat unanswered. What I'd like to do is pause over here. The remainder of this chapter, David offers a lamentation, a kina, on behalf of like a eulogy of sorts, a poetic eulogy on behalf of Shaul and his best friend Yonatan, his son, and the others that fell in battle over here. So we're going to pick up Ezat Hashem in our next class with this lamentation.